Black teen was vanished in 1978 to 17 years later. Farmer finds a trapdoor beneath a broken cowshed. This happened in Wilburn County, a quiet stretch of farmland in northeastern Georgia, about 40 miles outside Augusta. Back then, it wasn't even marked on most state maps. You could drive through the entire county and never see more than a gas station, a feed store, and maybe, if you were lucky, an old man on a porch who might nod at you as you passed. People didn't lock their doors in Wilburn in the 70s. The biggest crime most deputies dealt with was someone leaving a gate open and letting livestock wander onto the road. But all that changed on June 3, 1978. That's the date 14-year-old Darnell Watson disappeared. And no one ever saw him again. He was last seen walking home from his aunt's house just after sunset. A 3-mile dirt road separated her house from the modest single-story home he shared with his mother and little brother. He never made it back. What makes this story different, what kept it whispered about in Wilburn for decades, isn't just the disappearance. It's what happened nearly 2 decades later. In 1995, a retired farmer named Henry Leach was tearing down an old cowshed on his family's abandoned second property when he noticed something strange beneath the rotted floorboards. A trapdoor. Hidden. And what was underneath that trapdoor changed everything they thought they knew about what happened to Darnell Watson. But to understand why that moment mattered, why it sent a ripple through Wilburn County that no one could shake, you have to know the story before the story. You have to understand who Darnell Watson really was, who the people around him were, and how a whole town quietly learned to forget him. Because some things in Wilburn didn't add up from the very beginning. Darnell was born in 1964, in the middle of one of Georgia's longest droughts. His mother, Ella Mae Watson, worked as a cleaner at the Wilburn County Courthouse. She was known as quiet, respectful, and painfully private. Darnell's father had died 2 months before his birth in what was officially labeled a logging accident, though some older residents still muttered about how the details never sat right. They lived in a modest home at the edge of Dandridge Hollow, a stretch of wooded land most kids avoided after dark. Darnell, however, wasn't like most kids. He was observant. Always watching. Never the loudest in the room, but the one who noticed when a deputy parked on a different street than usual, or when the local pastor started locking his shed. His teachers described him as peculiar but gifted. Some said he had a memory like a camera. He once told his 6th grade science teacher, "People hide more than they tell. You just have to look at their shoes." His only real friend was an older boy named Miles Avery. Miles was 17 in 1978 and had a reputation in Wilburn. He worked odd jobs, drove a battered Ford pickup, and kept to himself. But for some reason, he took a liking to Darnell. They'd fish together in silence, share old comic books, and spend long afternoons wandering the wooded trails between their houses. The last person to speak to Darnell was his aunt, Clara Bell, who lived in a trailer near County Road 12. She said he left her place around 7:45 p.m., holding a bag of leftover cornbread and laughing about a story she'd told him. He was happy, she told investigators. Not scared. Not in a rush. Just normal. He should have made it home by 8:15. He never did. The first few days after Darnell vanished, no one panicked. People figured he got sidetracked, maybe with Miles. Maybe helping someone on the road. Ella Mae called the sheriff's office just after midnight. But the dispatcher told her not to worry. Boys run off all the time, she was told. But by the 3rd day, when Darnell's bike was found at the edge of a dried creek bed, covered in a thin layer of dust and leaning against a rusted barbed wire fence, people started asking harder questions. Sheriff Donald Wilkes launched a formal search on June 7. Volunteers walked the woods, dogs were brought in from Augusta, and the National Guard even loaned a chopper to scan the tree canopy. Nothing turned up. Not a backpack. Not a shoe. Not a thread of clothing. Then came the rumors. Some said they saw Miles's pickup speeding through the fields that night. Others claimed Darnell had been poking around the courthouse basement the week before, looking for secrets. Someone else swore they saw a man in a gray suit watching the Watson house from a distance, smoking cigarettes and writing in a notebook. But none of it stuck. By July, the search had gone cold. And then, like so many stories in small, quiet counties, it just faded. The official case file on Darnell Watson was quietly boxed up, labeled juvenile runaway, presumed missing, and moved to a storage room behind the DMV office in East Wilburn. Ella May kept his room untouched until the day she died in 1989. And for 6 years after that, no one mentioned Darnell Watson again. Not until the Trapdoor. The farmer's name was Henry Leach. He was 72 when he decided to tear down the old shed. Not because he needed the space. The land hadn't been farmed in over a decade. But Henry's grandson had come to stay with him for the summer, and the boy kept complaining about the stench behind the barn. The shed was built in the late 50s, back when Henry's father ran cattle and raised mules. It was leaning hard by 1995, its roof sunken in, the foundation split with vine rot. Half the boards had turned silver gray. There was no electricity to the back acreage anymore, no reason to visit it unless you were dumping old feed sacks or checking the fence line. But on June 12, Henry brought out a crowbar and decided to pull the thing apart himself. Said it gave him something to do. Said the noise kept his arthritis from creeping up in his elbows. That's when he found the trapdoor. It was just after 6 p.m., still light outside. He'd pried up the last 2 corner boards when he noticed the cut in the dirt, 4 perfect edges, forming a square about 3 feet across. It didn't look like part of the shed's original build. The door was made from thick planks. Newer than the rest, with rusted iron hinges sunk into poured concrete. Henry thought it was odd, but in Wilburn, things like that didn't cause alarm. People buried all kinds of nonsense on old farms. Time capsules. Storm cellars. Bootleg hooch from the Prohibition era. But what struck Henry wasn't the door. It was the lock. A padlock bolted shut from the outside. That meant whatever was down there wasn't meant to get out. Henry didn't call the sheriff right away. He went into the house, grabbed a hacksaw, and came back. It took him nearly an hour to saw through the corroded metal. He said the whole time, he kept thinking about snakes, how they sometimes curled up in tight places during dry months. But when the lock gave way and the trapdoor creaked open, what hit him first wasn't the darkness. It was the smell. By the time Deputy Raven Marks arrived, Henry was standing 20 feet away, breathing through a towel. He told her, "There's something down there," and pointed to the open hole. It was about 6 feet deep. A square pit lined with cinder blocks and sealed at the bottom with packed red clay. The space was barely wide enough for a grown man to lie down in, and on one side of the wall, faintly visible through years of dust and decay, was something carved into the block. A name. Darnell. Deputy Marks didn't speak for a moment. She just stood there, squinting at it. Then she told Henry to step back. She radioed for the county investigator. By the time the full forensics team showed up the next day, word had already gotten out. Local news vans parked outside the gate. Half of Wilburn lined up along the fence, waiting to hear what was found. Inside the pit, they found no body. No remains. No bones. Just an old notebook, half buried in clay, wrapped in 2 plastic bags that had long since started to degrade. The pages were still legible, though, and what they contained raised far more questions than answers. It was Darnell's handwriting. Everyone agreed on that. But the dates on the entries, they didn't start in 1978. They started in 1983. The first entry was short. June 5, 1983. "I'm not supposed to write. They told me not to. But the dark is too loud, and I have to remember my name." There were 27 entries in total. Most of them short, scattered, hard to follow, but there were repeating phrases. Words like "still here" and "he watches and trucks at night." He referred to someone only as the tall man, but gave no real description. But it was the final page that chilled everyone. "I think Mama forgot me. I think she's gone. The tall man stopped bringing food last week. I don't think I'm getting out. I'm not even sure this place is real anymore. If someone finds this, tell Miles I saw what he hid under the church floor." That last line set off a panic among investigators. There had been no church mentioned in the original investigation. Nothing about a hiding place. And more importantly, no explanation for how a boy missing since 1978 could have written something in 1983, 5 years later. Was he alive in that pit for years? Had he been moved there later? Or was someone else pretending to be him? There were no fingerprints on the notebook. No traces of DNA. The floor of the pit was too degraded for blood work. The only thing they found, wedged into the corner of a block, was a piece of fabric. Blue. Like denim. A forensic technician noted that it matched the type of jacket Darnell was last seen wearing. But without a body, it meant nothing conclusive. The case was reopened in July 1995. Detective Miriam Rios, newly transferred from Atlanta after years working cold cases, was put in charge. She was known for her relentlessness and her deep distrust of rural silence, as she called it. Her first move was to pull every file from 1978, including old patrol logs, school rosters, and courthouse employee records. One thing immediately jumped out to her. A name that kept appearing, buried in small mentions, on the edge of multiple reports. Miles Avery. He'd never been officially interviewed. Never brought in. Never questioned. In fact, in one of the final entries in the 1978 report, a deputy wrote, "Mother insists friend named Miles knows something. No evidence. Family insists he's a good boy." But by 1995, Miles was gone. Hadn't been seen in Wilburn since 1980. Detective Rios started looking for him. Cross-referenced DMV records, ran his name through property registries. What she found was both strange and oddly timed. Miles had purchased a trailer in southern Alabama under a different name, 5 weeks after the last dated entry in Darnell's notebook. The name he used? Daniel Ray. Detective Rios drove out to Butler County, Alabama, on a Wednesday afternoon. She didn't call ahead, didn't file for backup. That was her style. Go quiet, go fast. The trailer registered to Daniel Ray sat on a stretch of sunburnt land just past a feed mill, surrounded by pine scrub and the occasional rusted appliance. It was a single wide. Metal siding. Satellite dish rusted and hanging by a single bolt. The grass hadn't been cut in months, and a broken swing creaked in the wind. She knocked twice. No answer. Then again, louder. Still nothing. But as she turned to leave, she heard it. A shuffle. Movement. Then silence. Rios stepped off the porch slowly and circled around back. That's when she saw the shed, smaller than the one Henry Leach had torn down in Wilburn. This one was newer. Plywood door. Heavy lock. She noted it, took a picture, and returned to her car. 2 days later, with a signed warrant in hand, she came back. Inside the trailer, there was little, a mattress on the floor. A small table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a single drawer filled with old photographs and local church bulletins. On one of them, folded in half and tucked behind a Bible verse, was a photo of 2 boys, one clearly Miles, and the other a younger kid, wearing a blue denim jacket. The back was labeled in shaky handwriting. D, before the shed. The shed outside was empty, but not clean. A camera tripod was bolted to one corner. Chains on the opposite wall. No blood, no hair. Just a faint smell of oil and dirt. But in the floor beneath a rotted rug, Rios found another hatch. Smaller this time. Only about 2 feet wide. And inside, buried in a metal ammo box, were dozens of pages torn from school notebooks. Some were dated. Others were smeared and illegible. But they all repeated the same name again and again. Darnell. Only now, the entries were written in a different handwriting. It matched Miles's from high school records. The contents were disturbing. Disjointed. A mix of memory, command, and something else, like a person writing to convince themselves of a story. One note read, "He asked about the church again. Said he heard it through the floor. I told him he was dreaming. He stopped eating after that." Another said, "June 1984. I made a new door. He's not getting out again. The watchers come every third Thursday." What exactly Miles meant by watchers was unclear. Rios suspected mental illness. Maybe psychosis. But it didn't explain the consistency, the timelines. The places, the details Darnell could have never known if he hadn't been there. She returned to Wilburn with the photos, the notes, and a growing sense that what she was unraveling went beyond a single missing persons case. Rios wanted to know more about the church Darnell mentioned, the one with the floor hiding something. She dug into local property records and found only 3 churches within 15 miles of the Watson house back in 1978. One had burned down in 1982. Another had been converted into a tractor parts warehouse. The third, Street Emery's Chapel, was still standing, though barely. It sat at the end of Hollow Trace Road, where the gravel turned to dirt and the air started to smell like wet pine. It had been boarded up since 1989 after a lightning strike damaged the roof and local attendance dropped to 0. When Rios visited the site, the building groaned with wind. The cross was gone. One stained glass window remained, shattered halfway through. But what caught her attention was the floor. The boards were uneven, warped. And near the altar, covered by a dusty throw rug, was a ring-shaped iron handle. A trapdoor. This one opened easily, no lock. Inside was a short staircase, only 6 steps down, leading into a space no wider than a janitor's closet. The air was stale. The walls were concrete, painted long ago but now peeling in streaks. And on the far wall was a symbol. Charcoal, maybe old paint. A triangle, encircling a black circle with 3 lines striking through it, like a trident made of wire. There was no furniture. No personal items. But someone had lived there, or been there. She called it in. Forensics arrived the next morning. What they found embedded in the wall, almost invisible unless the light hit it right, were small notches. 17 of them. Scratched deep. Like tally marks. Rios remembered the line from Darnell's notebook. "Tell Miles I saw what he hid under the church floor." She was standing in it. But there were no answers, not yet. Only new questions. That's when someone mailed her the photograph. It came in a plain envelope, no return address. Postmarked from inside Wilburn. Just one photo, printed on old Kodak paper. It showed the same pit Henry Leach found, but from decades earlier. The trapdoor open, and a small figure, skinny, shirtless, arms behind his back, being lowered in by a man wearing a deputy's uniform. No face visible. Just the arm patch. Just the hat. Someone had been watching. And someone wanted her to know. Detective Rios sat in her car for nearly 40 minutes, staring at the photo. The boy in the pit, his spine visible, knees folded to his chest, couldn't be more than 12 or 13. The image was grainy, but the badge on the deputy's shoulder was unmistakable. Wilburn County. She made a copy and filed the original in a sealed evidence envelope. That same day, she drove back into town, but not to the sheriff's office. Instead, she took a detour down Old Hammond Lane. There was a woman she'd heard about through whispers. Someone who'd worked the switchboard for the department back in the 70s and had abruptly quit after what neighbors called a breakdown. Her name was Mildred Posey. She lived alone in a small, leaning house just past the cemetery. Age had curled her fingers and bowed her back, but her mind was still razor sharp. When Rios showed her the photo, Mildred didn't ask who the boy was. She asked one thing. Was that taken before the chapel closed, or after? Rios didn't answer. Mildred took a long breath. Her eyes never left the photo. They made me stop logging calls after that night. Told me it wasn't my place. But I heard him. That boy. I still hear his voice sometimes. Rios leaned forward. You heard Darnell? Mildred nodded slowly. Then, for the first time in 17 years, She told someone what she hadn't told the police. June 3, 1978. Mildred was working the night desk, a part-time fill-in job after her husband passed. Phones didn't ring much, but around 10:14 p.m., she caught something strange on the department's internal line. It wasn't a call. It was a cross pickup, when someone forgets to hang up fully. And two lines bleed into each other. She heard two voices. One, male, low and firm. The other, younger, crying, pleading. She couldn't make out every word, but she remembered two sentences exactly. "You said I could leave. And then, Mama's gonna know. She always knows." The man never raised his voice. Just murmured something Mildred couldn't fully catch, except for one phrase. "You saw the mark. You can't leave now." When she brought it up to Sheriff Wilkes the next morning, he told her it was nothing, probably the radio's acting up. A week later, she was reassigned to filing duty. A month after that, she quit. Mildred told Rios something else that night. "That church, St. Emery's, it was never right. My brother helped with repairs after the lightning strike. Said there was a room down there they never got permission to build. No blueprints. No permit. Just poured concrete and silence." Rios requested old building permits from the county archive. Most were incomplete, records lost in a flood back in '81. But she did find one blueprint, marked in faded ink, St. Emery's Chapel, built 1912, renovated 1959. On the plans, no subfloor was listed. Just crawlspace. No cellar. No trapdoor. No concrete chamber. But another document was tucked behind the schematic, handwritten, unofficial. A bill of sale. Equipment delivered for reinforcement and isolation. Dated 1977. Signed by Deputy G. Traylor. Rios's hands went still. Because she remembered that name. George Traylor had been one of Wilburn's longest-serving deputies, 31 years in uniform. He retired in 1990. No complaints on record. No disciplinary actions. But Rios went deeper. She pulled land records, court filings, pension papers. That's when she found it. Traylor's family owned the land behind the church. Not just adjacent, directly behind the chapel, past the woods. 22 acres. Private. Unmapped. And there was more. Traylor's cousin had once served as the chapel's groundskeeper. A man named Ellis Vance. Quiet, unmarried. Died in 1985, ruled a suicide. The obituary had a single line that stood out to Rios. "Ellis is survived by no children, but by the young men whose lives he helped shape at the chapel." Rios circled it. Stared at it. Then she pulled every missing persons report filed between 1968 and 1980. There were 5. All black boys. All between the ages of 11 and 15. All within a 30-mile radius. All dismissed as runaways. And not a single one of them had ever been found. Rios brought this to the State Bureau. They agreed to open a task force, but quietly. No press. No public announcements. Too many officials still tied to Wilburn. Too many questions no one wanted answered. In late August, they returned to the chapel site with ground-penetrating radar. What they found changed everything. Behind the altar, beneath a section of floor never disturbed before, was a second room. Larger. Sealed in concrete. With no entrance from above. No trapdoor. Just walls. It had no oxygen vent, no drainage, no way in or out. Unless it was sealed from the inside. They broke through 2 days later. Inside, there were 6 shoes. Children's sizes. No bodies. No clothing. Just the shoes, lined up perfectly along the north wall. And on the concrete, written in what looked like soot or ash, was a single phrase. "One left. He saw the sky again." The forensic team sent the shoes to a lab in Atlanta. Each pair was different, some cracked with age, others barely worn. But one pair in particular stood out, navy blue sneakers, size 6, with a torn lace and a faded white stripe on the side. Ella Mae Watson had described those exact shoes in her original missing persons report. They were the ones Darnell was wearing the night he vanished. Rios didn't speak for a long time after seeing them. She just sat in her car outside the forensics lab, gripping the steering wheel like it might float away. 6 shoes. 1 note. 1 left. He saw the sky again. If the timeline was correct, if Darnell had written the notebook and somehow escaped that room, then something happened in 1984 or 1985 that allowed him to break free. But why hadn't he come home? Why had no one seen him? And more urgently, who sealed the room back up? The task force wanted to push for exhumations, background checks, internal reviews. But in Wilburn, none of that came easy. Old families ran deep. People still called each other sir and ma'am out of habit, not respect. And Sheriff Donald Wilkes? Still alive. Still living in the same house, just 4 miles from the Watson property. Retired in 1991 with honors. No complaints. No inquiries. Just silence. Rios requested a meeting. He refused. So she went anyway. He met her on the porch, arms crossed, wearing a sleeveless undershirt and house slippers. His hair had gone white, but his posture still said authority. "You're digging up things that don't want to be dug," he told her. "What happened to Darnell Watson?" she asked. He didn't blink. Just looked out past the trees. "Some folks don't stay buried because they want justice. They stay buried because they need to be. Is that what the church was for?" He said nothing. Then he added, "You don't know the people who come when the lights go off out there." "I did what I had to do." "And the others?" she pressed. "The other 5 boys?" His voice dropped. Barely above a whisper. "They weren't supposed to be remembered." Rios stepped forward. Who else knew? The sheriff exhaled like he'd been holding the breath for 17 years. "Ask yourself this. You think I built that concrete room myself?" That night, her motel room phone rang at 2:12 a.m. No caller ID. Just silence for the first 3 seconds. Then a male voice, low and calm. "You're not local. You should stay that way." Click. The next morning, she returned to the Watson home, now long abandoned, its windows boarded, its porch sagging from rot. But she wanted to stand there. To see what Darnell saw. To walk the path from the porch to the tree line. To feel the distance he never crossed. Near the side of the house, in an overgrown patch of crabgrass. She found something odd, a small metal badge, half buried in the dirt. It was a deputy's pin. Tarnished. Bent. And on the back, scratched in faint lines barely visible, 3 letters. DWW. She turned it over again and again, unsure. Later, in the motel, she opened her notebook and compared her handwriting samples from the investigation. Darnell Watson's full name? Darnell William Watson. The badge didn't belong to any known deputy. It wasn't standard issue from the 1970s or 80s. It looked older. Handmade, even. Like a copy. Was it his? Had he taken it? Or had someone given it to him? And if so, why? The local historical society office, a small trailer beside the library, held a dusty archive of Wilburn's earliest civic records. In a crate labeled Law Enforcement, MISC, 1930-1980, she found a thin manila envelope with faded ink and water stains. Inside was a photo. 5 boys, standing in a line. One of them, the tallest, had a black circle drawn over his face in pen. The rest were just faces. The back read, Class of 1975. St. Emery's Altar Boys. She recognized one of them. Ellis Vance, the groundskeeper who'd shaped young men. Another was clearly George Traylor. But the last 2, she hadn't seen before. She sent the image to the state facial recognition lab. 3 days later, they responded. One of the unknown boys matched a man currently living in Texas under a different name. The match was tentative, but the man had served in private security. He had sealed juvenile records. The other, the one with the blacked-out face? No match. No ID. Not in any database. Almost like he'd never existed. Or someone had erased him. That same week, the state team returned to the chapel ruins with one last warrant. They began to dig not just beneath the altar, but under the woods behind it, the land that once belonged to George Traylor. By the third day, they hit stone. Not natural rock, but a circle of brick, layered in clay and soot, surrounded by what appeared to be burned fragments of wood and bone. Inside the circle was a box. Metal. Sealed shut. Inside the box, a small Bible, a strip of cloth with blood traces, and a cassette tape. They had to track down a player. When they finally listened to the tape, it was faint. Warped. But the voice that came through, hoarse, slow, said one thing, over and over. You weren't supposed to find me. You weren't supposed to find me. You weren't supposed to. Until the tape warped and cut out. No name. No date. No explanation. The tape was submitted for forensic audio analysis. The state lab tried to recover more of the degraded recording, but nothing new came through. Just static, breath, and the same haunting loop, you weren't supposed to find me. But what unnerved Rios most wasn't what was on the tape. It was the casing. Inside the player, scratched into the metal spool holder, were the initials. M.A. Miles Avery. The FBI quietly joined the investigation in early October. Under the pretense of historical civil rights violations. They opened what they called a legacy crimes inquiry, looking at patterns of abuse and uninvestigated disappearances in Wilburn County over a 30-year span. But even with federal resources, everything hit the same wall. No records of the boys in the chapel photo. No arrest history for Ellis Vance. No written permit or structural report for the underground rooms. And most baffling of all, no death certificate for Miles Avery. Not under that name. Not under Daniel Ray. Not anywhere. He had simply vanished. Then, a letter arrived. Typed. No signature. Postmarked from Pensacola, Florida. It contained only a single line. He didn't escape. He was let go. Attached was a photograph, printed on thin paper. It showed what looked like a forest trail, heavily overgrown, with a shape just barely visible in the distance. A person? Maybe. Wearing a blue jacket. But the back of the photo told a different story. A date. August 18, 1985. And a location. Willow's End, TN. Rios stared at it for hours. Then checked the date against Darnell's final notebook entry. Same week. She drove to Willow's End, a near abandoned town in rural Tennessee, barely hanging on with a population under 400. The local sheriff's office hadn't filed a missing persons report in years. One gas station, one diner, one tiny post office. She walked in and asked if they'd ever had a runaway come through in 1985, a boy. Early teens, wearing a denim jacket. The woman at the counter didn't blink. You mean the one who stayed with the preacher? Rios froze. What preacher? Reverend Callahan. Took him in. Didn't say much. Kid didn't speak much either. Stayed a couple months, then disappeared again. You ever get a name? He called himself Darnell. Wouldn't give a last name. Reverend Callahan had died in 1993. But the church still kept a ledger of visitors and temporary residents, a habit from older times. Rios flipped through the 1985 entries. There it was. August 19th, Darnell W. lodged in West Wing. Silent boy. Prays alone. Says they're still watching. 2 weeks later. Gone. Left before sunup. Took nothing. Left no note. That was the last trace. But it proved one thing. He had escaped. Rios drove back to Wilburn. Her mind ran circles the entire ride. The pit, the tally marks, the shoes, the names, the voices, the fact that Darnell had somehow made it out, seen sky again, and yet never returned. Why? What had scared him enough to stay gone? And more disturbingly, who let him out? Back in her motel room, she found a note slipped under her door. No envelope. Just a folded scrap of yellowed paper. Inside were 4 words. Don't trust the chapel. That night, she couldn't sleep. The next morning, the church ruins had been vandalized. Someone, or several people, had come in the night and torched the remainder of the floor. Burned through planks, shattered support beams. The entry to the underground chamber had collapsed. But the strangest part wasn't the arson. It was what was found spray painted on the brick wall behind the altar. A single symbol. A black circle with 3 lines through it. The same as before. But this time, someone had added words beneath it. We owe the 6. No one knew what it meant. At least not at first. Weeks later, an archivist from the Georgia Bureau found an old pamphlet in a box labeled Faith-Based Initiatives, 1973, a state program meant to partner with rural churches for community development. One of the proposals was authored by a man named Ellis Vance. The document referenced a pilot program, supposedly launched with state funds but never approved. Its name? The 6 Pillars: Restoration through Structure, Silence, and Service. The 6 boys? The 6 shoes? Was it all connected? And if so, who approved it? The final page listed a review board made up of local officials and faith leaders. One name jumped off the page. D. Wilkes, then sheriff. When Rios confronted him again, he was already in hospice care. Cancer. Lungs. Could barely speak. She showed him the document. He looked at it and said, almost inaudibly, "We were told it would help them." "Who told you?" He closed his eyes. Took a long, trembling breath. "They came from upstate. Suits. Said some boys need structure. Said some minds bend if you keep them still long enough." Rios felt her stomach turn. What happened to the ones who didn't bend? Wilkes opened his eyes. For a split second, only that, she saw regret. Then he said, "They disappeared. Or maybe, they finally got quiet." A month after the chapel ruins were torched, the investigation was quietly shut down. Not officially, on paper, it was paused pending further developments. But Rios saw what it really meant. The State Bureau stopped returning her calls. The FBI agents went quiet. Even her access to the Wilburn County archives was revoked without explanation. Too many names. Too much weight. But she wasn't done. She went back to Henry Leach, the old farmer who'd first uncovered the pit. He didn't answer his door, but his neighbor told her Henry had been in the hospital. "Heart trouble," the woman said. "But it ain't his heart that's dying. It's his memory. Keeps asking about boys in the shed." Rios visited him the next day. Henry was thinner, sunken into the hospital bed like an old shirt washed too many times. But his eyes, they were clear. Sharp. "It wasn't the first thing I found, you know," he said quietly. Rios leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Henry looked at the ceiling. Breathing slow. "Back in I-79, I found something on that land. Didn't say a word. Wasn't my business back then." "What did you find?" "A cross. Buried. Upside down. Wrapped in rope. And a photo. A kid with tape on his mouth. I thought it was some sick prank." "You still have it?" He nodded toward the corner of the room. In an old shoebox, beneath layers of newspaper, Rios found it. The photo. It was grainy. Water damaged. But the eyes. It was Darnell. Mouth taped. Knees to chest. Inside what looked like a concrete room. The same as the pit. On the back of the photo. He asked the wrong question. She brought the photo to the digital forensics unit at the State University. They confirmed the paper stock was consistent with 1970s local developers. No alterations. Genuine. But the room in the background had something new. A symbol etched into the wall, partially obscured by Darnell's shoulder. When enhanced, it was unmistakable. That same circle with 3 lines. And next to it, in faint chalk: "Stand still. Stay good. Stay gone." It wasn't a prayer. It was a rule. Rios started digging again. Late nights. Motel coffee. Newspaper archives on microfiche. She found a series of local notices from 1972 to 1980. Odd patterns. Local boy vanishes on walk home, no foul play suspected. Teen from neighboring county reported missing, later dropped. Community event canceled due to church maintenance. Each time, the timeline overlapped. And more disturbing, each disappearance coincided with a revival event at St. Emery's Chapel. Preachers rotated in and out over the years. All claimed temporary placements. All were hard to trace. But one name came up 3 times. Reverend Leon March. No photos. No interviews. No obituary. Just a name. Rios called every church registry from Georgia to Tennessee. No record. She began to wonder if he even existed. Until the VHS arrived. It came in a padded envelope with no return address, sent to her home, not her office. No note. No markings. Just the tape. Labeled only: "The Boy in the Corner." Rios had to borrow a player from a pawn shop. When she hit play, the screen buzzed with static. Then, grainy footage of what looked like a church basement, dim lighting, cement walls, one flickering bulb overhead. A boy sat on the floor. Knees drawn up. Same position as the photo. Then a voice. Off screen. "Calm. Too calm. Tell us again what you saw." The boy flinched. His voice cracked. "The tall one. With the coat. He told me the church didn't stop at the walls." "And where does it go?" "Into the trees." Silence. Then a metallic sound, maybe a door. Maybe chains. The boy covered his ears. The voice again. "You need to stop remembering." Cut to static. Forensics confirmed the footage had not been recently altered. The voice could not be matched. But the boy? Rios sent the footage to Darnell's surviving relatives. His cousin, now in his 40s, watched 10 seconds before whispering. "That's him. He used to cover his ears like that when he was scared." The problem was, Darnell was never supposed to be recorded. No one admitted to seeing him after 1978. No one claimed to have taken photos or video. And yet, here he was, filmed, documented, controlled. Which raised the most dangerous question yet. Who was behind the camera? The symbols reappeared around Wilburn that fall. Spray painted on barns. Etched into trees. One farmer found it carved into the hide of a dead calf, 3 lines inside a circle. No footprints. No tire tracks. Just the symbol. And no one talked about it. People turned away. Like they'd seen it before. Like it was part of some old agreement no one wanted to name. Then came the fire. Ella Mae Watson's old house, long abandoned, burned to the ground in the middle of the night. No one claimed responsibility. No one saw anything. But when fire crews sifted through the rubble, they found a box beneath the floorboards, charred but intact. Inside were newspaper clippings. A small pair of blue sneakers. A note in faint ink. "He came home once. Didn't stay. Said the woods don't forget." And at the bottom, beneath layers of old hymn pages, a Polaroid photo. Darnell. Older. Maybe 17. Standing in front of a gas station. Behind him, just barely in frame, stood a man in a gray coat. Eyes hidden behind sunglasses. Expression blank. But his hand? Resting on Darnell's shoulder. The man in the Polaroid, the one with the gray coat and sunglasses, hand on Darnell's shoulder, was never identified. Rios scanned his face through every available database. No hits. She took the image to 2 retired Wilburn deputies. One squinted and said, "Could be Traylor's brother." The other just shook his head. "Doesn't matter who he is. What matters is who's behind him." What do you mean? I mean, he said, voice dropping, nobody puts their hand on a kid's shoulder in that town unless they already know how it ends. The image wasn't dated, but forensic analysis placed it somewhere between 1987 and 1989, based on the type of film and cornerware. That would mean Darnell had survived at least 10 years after his disappearance. So why hadn't he gone home? Why hadn't he told anyone? Unless someone was still watching. Later that winter, Rios got a call from a journalist in Tallahassee named Clark Rendell. He said he'd heard rumors about a reopened Wilburn case, boys, churches, underground rooms. Most people had dismissed it as rural hysteria. But Rendell had seen something. A man approached him in 1992 during a courthouse protest in Jacksonville. Said he had documents, evidence, a whole box from the chapel. Rendell never took him seriously. The man looked sick, paranoid. But what stuck with Rendell was one thing. He kept repeating a name. Said it like a prayer. Darnell. 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 Rendell finally searched through his old tapes, field interviews he never logged. He found one. Dated June 1992. Static heavy, background noise thick. But the voice, rough, panicked, spoke clearly. He got out. But they saw him again. In the trees. You don't get out of Wilburn unless they let you. Who are they? Rendell asked off tape. The answer? The watchers. The quiet ones. The ones that let the chapel stay open. Where is Darnell now? Silence. Then. Gone. But not missing. Rios replayed the tape over and over. She couldn't shake one line. You don't get out of Wilburn unless they let you. It echoed something she'd heard before. Back during her first visit to St. Emery's Chapel, when she'd spoken to Mildred Posey, the switchboard operator. That day, as she walked away, Mildred had whispered something just under her breath. Rios hadn't caught it the first time. But now she remembered. That church never had locks on the doors, you know. Not even once. Why not? Rios had asked. Mildred had looked at her and said. Because it wasn't meant to keep people out. It was built to keep something in. The final piece came by accident. A college student, working an unrelated genealogy project in Augusta, scanned decades of obituaries from Wilburn County. One, from April 1986, stood out. It was for a boy named Timothy Sloan, age 14. Died of exposure during a hiking accident. But no funeral was held. And no family was listed. Only one sentence at the bottom of the obituary. He was looked after. Rios searched every county database. There was no death certificate. No incident report. Nothing. But what she did find was this. Timothy Sloan was last seen alive wearing a denim jacket. She returned to Wilburn one last time. Walked the path behind the church ruins. Past the woods. Past the ash pit. Past the fallen cross buried by Henry Leach decades earlier. She found nothing. No sign. No answers. But as she turned to leave, she heard something behind her, faint. Like the echo of gravel underfoot. Like breathing, just beyond the tree line. She stood still. The woods went silent. She walked faster. Didn't turn around. Back in her car, there was something on her windshield. A small piece of paper. 4 words. He saw them again. She never went back. Today, if you drive through Wilburn County, you won't see much. The chapel is gone. The lot is fenced and marked for development. People don't talk about the boys. They don't mention the pit, the names, or the watchers. But sometimes, near Hollow Trace Road, people still report strange things. Lights in the woods. Smoke from where the church used to be. A symbol, a black circle, with 3 thin lines, scratched into the backs of road signs. And once, just last summer, a woman driving past the old cemetery swore she saw a boy standing in the grass. no older than 14. Wearing a blue denim jacket. She pulled over. But when she stepped out, there was no one there. Only a pair of footprints in the dirt. And a voice, faint, carried on wind through pine trees, whispering something over and over. Stay good. Stay gone. Stay good. Stay gone. Black teen was vanished in 1978 to 17 years later. Farmer finds a trapdoor beneath a broken cowshed. The story never ends. Because in Wilburn, some boys never came home. And some still haven't left.